Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Thank you for joining me for folks' favorite Fandom Friday. Now, every Friday, I get the chance to visit with somebody from the wide world of the Tolkien fandom. Musicians and writers, craftsmen and content creators, artists and scholars, and a whole lot more. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming somebody who, well, honestly fits into just about all of those categories, actually. Scholar, linguist, podcaster, and a whole lot more. And by a whole lot, I mean if I ran a full intro, we wouldn't have 3 minutes to chat with him. Folks, please welcome James Tauber to today's Tolkien Times.
Thank you very much, Alan.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Now, of course, you and I have talked about this back when you co-hosted the PPP with me last season. But can you tell this audience how and when you first encountered Middle-earth and what it is about Tolkien's works that keeps you coming back?
Absolutely. So, like a lot of people, I started with The Hobbit. I was about 10 or 11 years old. But my journey with Tolkien became unusual after that. My aunt knew that I was a big fan of The Hobbit. And for my 12th birthday, bought me a copy of Return of the King. And of course, I couldn't read it, knowing full well that there were two parts prior to it that I hadn't read. So instead, I dived into the appendices and immediately fell in love with the description of, in particular, the First Age.
Oh, wow!
And from that, became very interested in the Silmarillion. I tried reading the Silmarillion as a 12-year-old and failed miserably. I didn't get past the Ainulindalë, but I became extremely interested in the Ainulindalë.
As a 12-year-old, I could imagine that, yeah.
But then I came across Robert Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth.
Oh, yeah.
And really fell in love with that. And this was also around the time that the volumes of the History of Middle-earth were coming out as well.
Okay.
And so I started buying those. And my attention sort of was taken away from Lord of the Rings, and I was far more interested in finding out more about the languages and about the First Age history and so on. And so it wasn't actually till a couple of decades later when the Peter Jackson films came, well, decade and a half later when the Peter Jackson films came out, that I returned to Lord of the Rings.
Wow. After all that time.
Yeah. So it's unusual reading order. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but it does mean that I've always had a particular fondness, not just for The Hobbit, but for all of that legendarium behind it all. Yeah.
Yeah, the Silmarillion in quotes as opposed to the Silmarillion in italics, meaning all of that stuff that makes up the First Age and not just the Quintus Silmarillion. Yeah,
exactly. And so, funnily enough, I ended up probably reading the different versions of the Ainulindalë before I progressed to the rest of the published.
Oh my goodness, you might be the only person I know who's read the music of the Ainur before they read the Fellowship of the Ring. Yeah,
that's true. Yes,
that's pretty wild. So one of the things that most of us would know you for is the fact that you run the Digital Tolkien Project, but you also teach a class at Signum University on the history of Middle-earth. You're about to start teaching a class on Bach's Goldberg variations. You're also a real-life philologist with knowledge of ancient Greek and Germanic. The obvious question is, when do you sleep? But I'm going to ask you a different one. What's your motivation? What keeps driving you to do so much for so many? And not solely for the Tolkien community, but honestly for a lot of the, I guess, adjacent communities in which many of us nerds find ourselves, like the languages or music.
Yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately comes down, first of all, to just a love of learning. I just can't help myself in terms of learning new things. And I also just get a tremendous joy out of working out ways of passing that on to others, particularly to turn things that may scare people off, may seem overly complex, how to distill that down into a simpler form. One of my favorite teaching experiences was a class that I ran on the Silmarillion, specifically for people who had struggled with the Silmarillion before.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so it's just taking those kinds of things. And similarly with the Bach Goldberg variations, which I'm teaching with Sarah.
Yeah, that sounds intimidating as heck. I'm just like, what?
We started that this week. Okay. And but again, it's one, it's a work that's idolized by many as well as loved by many. And so we're just having fun this month, really breaking it apart, going into detail, explaining what's interesting about each of the various variations and so on. And it's just that sort of thing I love doing. I love learning something and working out how to teach it in response to that. Yeah.
That's great stuff. Well, speaking of teaching, of course, you are nearing the end of that year-long journey through the history of Middle-earth at Signum, which has been fantastic from all I've heard from the people who've been able to do it, because, of course, I've been too busy to take it. Tell us a bit about this project, what it's been like. Is it what you expected? And maybe what have you learned as the instructor?
Yeah. So this is one of those examples where I deliberately set out to teach something in large part because I wanted to study it more myself. I think a lot of teachers do this, right?
That.
They pick a topic to teach on to force themselves to do the research and so on. And the origins of it,
podcasters do that too. Let me just tell
I can imagine. The origins of it were actually at the New York special event for the Rings of Power.
Oh yeah.
After we'd seen the premiere of it, and a bunch of us went out to an Irish pub afterwards at 2:00 in the morning. I think we were at the Irish pub until.
I'm so bummed I missed that. I had arrived super late that morning because of a flight problem, and so I thought, you guys go have fun. I'm gonna go back to the hotel and sleep. Now I'm kicking myself. All right.
So I'm sitting at this pub with Corey Olsen, and it all of a sudden occurred to me, there are 12 volumes of the history of Middle-earth, and there are 12 months to the year.
Indeed, there are.
And the Signum Space Program, the adult continuing education program that Signum offers, has month-long modules. And I thought, what if I ran 12 modules, one a month for each volume of the history of Middle-earth? And I pitched this to Corey at 2 a.m. at an Irish pub, and he loved the idea, of course.
That's an easy way to get a yes.
Exactly, yeah. I think he would have said yes anyway. But
I think so.
Yeah, and so we announced this course, and the first problem we hit was that the sort of general idea of these space courses is that they're small, very interactive. We tried to keep the groups to between 6 to 12 people, and we had over 40 people sign up for this.
Oh, wow.
And there was no way I was going to do what amounts to, so it's 8-hour-long sessions through the month. And I was going to have to do that like 4 times to keep class sizes down. No. And so with Rob Goslin, who runs the space program at Signum, we kind of brainstormed some ideas, and Corey and Rob had been keen to try out this sort of hybrid approach where there would be more lecture style sessions for half of the time, and then discussion sections for the other half of the time. And so I teamed up initially with Dr. Sarah Brown and Tom Hillman. Later joined by Patrick Lyon as well. So they took the more discussion oriented sections for half the time, and then I give the more lecture style 4 sessions a month. And then on top of that, we decided, wouldn't it be fun to get John Garth to come in?
No, it's always fun to have John Garth to come in
and join me for one of those sessions. So each month, it's 3 lectures with me, a 4th with me and John Garth, and then the discussion sections. And so,
very cool.
Even though it sounds like a huge, long, and I mean it is long, we're still only just scratching the surface. There's so little of each volume that we can
covering an entire volume in just a month.
Yeah. I jokingly said the next step is to do 1 volume a year and to do 12 modules just on each volume.
You can't joke about things like that with Corey because he'll take you up on it.
Well, it's still probably
a 12-year class. Perfect.
He'll probably still be doing Exploring Lord of the Rings before I finish my...
Yeah, exactly. So 12 years? Wait a minute. That's how long I'm going to spend on the Council of Elrond. I don't understand why you're going so fast.
So the approach that I've had to take is not to try to cover everything, but instead to, first of all, provide sort of a framework to understand what's going on, to make it less intimidating. This comes back to that whole idea of me really loving working out how to better explain something. Yeah. And so what I've tried to do every month is say, okay, what's the sort of the overall structure you need to understand? How do the different versions of the texts interrelate with one another, and then to just pick out certain interesting comparisons to make. And so we might, for example, just look at the changes that were made to the Scouring of the Shire, which is a really interesting chapter actually to
I can't wait to get to that on the Prancing Pony podcast for that exact reason. Yeah,
the early drafts are just wonderful. No, I won't spoil it for people.
No, please don't.
Other than to say that the first draft is quite different.
It is
from the published version. And so, we looked at that. We didn't look at every individual chapter of Lord of the Rings, but that was one of the chapters that we looked at.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun. So
that makes sense.
It's been a wonderful experience, and I've learnt a lot, both in terms of the sort of small detail, the subtleties, the changes that were made here and there. Sometimes Tolkien just changing a word here or there, or making character changes and so on. But also just forcing myself to try to come up with that 10,000-foot view and say, how do I explain how this whole thing fits together? So it's been a really, really wonderful experience. And also it's given me an excuse to do a lot of the digitization for the Digital Tolkien Project as well, because I already had Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales all sort of digitized and in a format to like ask interesting research questions of. The history of Middle-earth was not in that state, and so I've taken it as a bit of an opportunity to extract the different versions. Of course, one of the challenges with History of Middle-earth, this was true of Unfinished Tales too, is that unlike Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion or the Hobbit, where you're getting John Ronald's text the whole time, with Unfinished Tales and History of Middle-earth, you're getting this interleaving of Christopher's commentary and Christopher's notes interleaved with his father, or transcriptions of his father's manuscripts. And so a lot of the work I've had to do is sort of separate those out in my electronic versions to make it easier to see what's the underlying text in the manuscript versus what Christopher
had to say in his commentary. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man, I can see why that would be a bit of a challenge, but you'd had some work with Unfinished Tales before, and at least that had, presumably helped you set up some sort of system to do that.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of the Digital Tolkien Project, any new developments there? I know much of what you do there ends up being limited by copyright issues. So where does the Digital Tolkien Project currently stand? And maybe where do you see it going over the next year or two?
Absolutely. So one of the big things that we just finished up with a lot of help from volunteers is speaker identification, going through The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion, and identifying who is speaking in each example of direct speech. And that enables really interesting questions to be asked about how different characters speak and where different words are used by different characters. And so I was actually able to do some research for my master's dissertation, but also the talk that I gave at Oxenmoot covered this as well. Looking at, for example, differences between the way Sam speaks and the way Frodo speaks, or the way that Frodo's speech differs as the story progresses. That's only possible if you've got a digital text where all of the direct speech is annotated with who's doing the speaking.
That's true.
And so that was something that, I can't necessarily share the raw information with everyone, but there's a lot of research questions that people can come to me with, and we can look at the data together and search for things. It's something that I'm hoping, for example, that will be possible soon in Search Tolkien, the search interface that I have to the text, that you'll be able to not only search for individual words or phrases, but also limit that to particular speakers. So if you're interested, when does Frodo use this word?
I want to find when Aragorn said X, or I want to find when Frodo said this.
Yeah. So we've got all the data for that now, and it's just a case of laying on top of that. But the other big thing that we've just started, it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time, is what I'm referring to as the Tolkien glossary. So there's a lot of questions that I myself and others have of the text that involve some information annotation of just individual words. So people will sometimes come to me and say, can you tell me all the places where Tolkien uses a color or mentions a type of tree or uses Old English words or uses Sindarin words or whatever it is. And in each case, in order to answer that question, I need to know, well, what are the colors? What words are colors? What words are trees? What words are Sindarin or Old English and so on?
Well, I can tell you at least one of the trees, the larch. Sorry. Little Monty Python reference for those of you who don't get that. But anyway, continue. I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. And so what the Tolkien glossary is, it's very, very early stages, but the goal of it is to basically enable that kind of word level annotation. And so that can feed into all sorts of other research questions, searching based not on the actual word, but on what category is the word.
Right.
So show me all the places.
That opens
Sindarin
up a lot.
Exactly. And, and also annotating, just take a word like mithril, right? Yeah. Your recent Word Nerd
Mailbag
Wednesday
Monday,
word.
right.
What you said a bunch of information during that. If somebody's interested in Mithril, having a place they can go and give me the information about Mithril. Where does it occur? The fact that it occurs once in the latest edition of the Hobbit, 15 times in the text of Lord of the Rings, but other questions as well, like what are the hyphenated words that Mithril appears in?
Right.
Because that's something that's not always easy to search for if you're interested in, it's not just the word Mithril, but Mithril hyphen, so on. And so there's all that
Mithril
sort of
vests.
Exactly.
Mithril coat. Yeah.
But even things like being able to search for contractions when a certain word's contracted. One of the things that I've looked at is the way that different characters contract words or don't contract words.
Presumably Sam contracts a lot, but
Sam contracts all the time.
Contracts very little.
Exactly. And in fact, most the elves never do.
I'm not surprised.
One of the most interesting things that's come up in this research is Saruman does not contract his words until book 6. And so after he's sort of been humiliated and he's in his beggar form.
Sort of lowered.
Exactly. He's lowered. And at that point, he starts to use contracted forms of saying don't instead of do not and so on.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, but that sort of thing is only really possible if we go through and annotate these texts. Another thing that a lot of people always ask is, does Tolkien tend to use Germanic words more in certain parts than Latinate words? Well, in order to answer that question, you have to go through and annotate all the words. Are they Germanic or Latinate?
Is this a Germanic word? Is this a Latinate word? Right.
So again, the Tolkien glossary is going to be a database that captures that sort of
this
information.
is mind-blowing stuff, James.
Yeah. So my hope is that it's sort of an entry point to any kind of word study that gets done.
Yeah.
I'm hoping.
Could you have done this a few years ago when we were starting the podcast? Because this would have been the best resource ever. Would have made us look like geniuses.
Well, I mean, it's funny because I'm wanting to not only do things like integrate with the OED is going to be one of the things that I will do, but I'm also hoping that it can provide a way of linking to all the work that you and Alan have done on well, I mean, now with the Word Nerd Wednesday, but also Philology Fair and so on.
Oh, that Sean has done with the Philology Fairs.
Exactly. Yeah. So being able to index those in the glossary as well. So when people are looking at a word, they'll see, there was actually a Philology Fair about that word.
Oh, that's great.
Go
I know we're hoping to eventually build a wiki that we can have some editors come on and sort of volunteer their time to transcribe those things, because transcription apps are terrible when it comes to those kinds of things, especially Sindarin or Quenya words. Forget it.
So another thing somebody suggested quite recently is include pronunciation guides for the Elvish words and so on. So that's another thing that I'll do.
That would be wonderful.
The idea is to really just have this database. Unfortunately, because information about individual words is not a copyright problem, this will be freely available for people. People can check it out already, even though it's very, very early stages. It is publicly available for people to check it out, and I'm hoping that it's something that people will contribute to as well, because a lot of the kinds of things, coming back to those categories like colors or trees or items of clothing or whatever it is that people want to look for, that's going to require a lot of human annotation to go through and tag all those words. So that's something I'm looking forward to crowdsourcing. And
man, that is going to be fantastic. So where can people find you and then follow all of these amazing, incredible things you're doing for the Tolkien community?
So the website overall for the Digital Tolkien Project is just digitaltolkien.com.
Okay.
But there's also the glossary is going to be at glossary.digitaltolkien.com. And the search engine is available at search.digitaltolkien.com.
Okay.
I've recently started doing YouTube videos as well, inspired by your good self. So check out Digital Tolkien, the Digital Tolkien channel on YouTube as well.
Okay.
Where I'll be giving updates, and we have a Discord server that's linked to from the digitaltolkien.com website that I encourage people to join if they want to participate in any way. Contribute to the data that we're gathering, or
we'll get a link. We'll get an invite from you that we can put in the caption to the videos and in our show notes for the podcast, and that way folks can get directly to the Discord server from there.
Excellent.
Well, folks, that is it for today's Fandom Friday, but be sure to come back next week for another Fandom Friday to meet yet another of your fellow Tolkien fans and maybe even learn what niches of the community you might be interested in exploring. Now, of course, if you're interested in joining me here on today's Tolkien Times for a future Fandom Friday, let me know by emailing Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a whole lot more. And please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as we wrap up this week with Silmarillion Saturday. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Please follow or subscribe on your podcast apps and follow at Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.